The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into the brass mailbox at the end of Jack Morrison's driveway in crisp, organized Clearwater Springs, the kind of neighborhood where HOA violations were treated like crimes against humanity. Jack stood in his garage with the envelope in one hand, a cold cup of coffee in the other. The sun hadn't even burned through the morning mist yet. He'd already been up for 3 hours, the way he'd been up for 3 hours every morning for the past 30 years. Old habits from his contracting days. You got up early, you stayed ahead of the game. He opened the letter carefully, though something in his gut told him to burn it instead. Dear Mr. Morrison, it has come to the Architectural Control Committee's attention that a 2024 Ford F-150 Super Crew pickup truck has been parked in your driveway for the past 4 weeks. Per Section 4.2 of the Clearwater Springs Homeowners Association Covenant and Restrictions, commercial class vehicles are prohibited from being parked in visible residential areas. This includes pickup trucks with commercial-grade bumpers, tool racks, and commercial-grade suspensions. You have 14 days to remedy this violation or face a $500 fine. Subsequent violations will result in compounding monthly fines of $100 until the vehicle is removed or relocated to a garage. The committee appreciates your immediate attention to this matter. Sincerely, Margaret Chen, HOA President, Clearwater Springs Community Association. Jack read it 3 times, then he read it again. The truck was his new hobby project. Nothing commercial about it. He'd bought it specifically because he was retiring next month, finally done with 40 years of running Morrison construction, done with the stress, done with the crews and the permits and the inspectors and the clients who changed their minds about everything the moment foundation work began. He was going to learn to fish, maybe do some woodworking, restore a truck. That was the plan. He set the letter down on his workbench and stared at it. His wife, Carol, found him there 20 minutes later, still in his paint-stained Columbia work shirt, still holding that cold coffee. Bad news, she asked, though she already knew. They'd been married for 32 years. She could read his face like a contract addendum. The HOA is threatening me over the truck. Carol, practical, kind, the woman who'd kept their household running while Jack built shopping centers and residential developments, took the letter from the bench. She read it quickly, then looked up at him with that expression that meant she was about to say something that contradicted his current emotional state. Well, they're right technically, she said. It does say. It's not a commercial vehicle, Carol. It's a pickup truck. You see pickup trucks in driveways all across this country in neighborhoods just like this one. It's an arbitrary rule written by people who have too much time on their hands. Carol folded the letter carefully and set it down. You could move it into the garage or park it on the street. The garage is full of your exercise equipment and my tools, and parking it on the street feels like I'm already accepting defeat. She kissed the top of his head. Don't do anything rash, Jack. These people take their rules seriously. He knew they did. He'd watched Margaret Chen, the HOA president, enforce every covenant in the handbook with the zealousness of a Soviet border guard. He'd been at the last community meeting where she'd fined the Hendersons for painting their front door an unapproved shade of taupe. He'd kept his mouth shut then, kept his head down. But this was different. This was his property, his truck, his driveway. That afternoon, Jack did what he always did when faced with a problem. He made spreadsheets. He documented every pickup truck in Clearwater Springs that wasn't currently parked in a garage or on the street. There were 7, including one directly across from Margaret Chen's house that had been there for 6 months without incident. He took photographs, noting the make, model, and color of each one. He checked the HOA records online and found no violations filed against any of them. Then he did a Google search and spent 4 hours falling down the rabbit hole of HOA harassment stories. People fined for Christmas lights that were 1 inch too large. A woman threatened with legal action because her rose garden violated flora aesthetic guidelines. A man who'd been hit with a $10,000 claim because his driveway was allegedly the wrong shade of gray. By 6 o'clock, Jack had worked himself into a state, not angry exactly, calculated, the kind of focused fury he'd developed over decades of dealing with difficult clients and regulatory nightmares. He called Margaret Chen. Hi, Margaret, it's Jack Morrison from Clearwater Lane. Her voice changed immediately, became honeyed. Jack, how are you? I hope you're enjoying the community. It really is the most wonderful place to live. I got your letter about my truck. A pause, she was calculating too. Ah yes, the pickup truck situation. I know these rules can seem a bit rigid to newcomers, but they really do help maintain property values. I'm sure once you understand. I've lived here for 8 years, Margaret, and I'm wondering why my truck is a violation when there's a Silverado parked at 447 Elm Street, directly across from your house. That's been there for 6 months without a single letter. Another pause, longer this time. That truck belongs to their contractor. It's temporary. My truck is going to be in my driveway, permanently, as my personal property, which I own, on property that I also own. He could hear her smile evaporate. The covenant is clear, Jack. All residents must comply or face consequences. Then perhaps you could apply those consequences consistently. He hung up before she could respond. That night, Carol made his favorite dinner, lasagna with the homemade noodles she rarely bothered with anymore. They ate in the dining room with their phones off, the way they used to do before the world required constant connectivity. "How was your day?" she asked, already knowing. "I handled the truck situation." "How?" I called Margaret Chen and pointed out that she's selectively enforcing the rules. Carol set down her fork. "Jack." "What? It's true. There are other pickup trucks in this neighborhood without violations. She's targeting me specifically." Maybe she just noticed yours because it's in your driveway and she's looking out her window. And maybe, Carol said carefully, you should just move the truck and avoid this whole thing. But Jack was already thinking about what came next, already planning the response to Margaret's response, already 3 steps ahead in a chess game he hadn't wanted to play. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment. This was where everything changed. The moment he decided to stop accepting the world as it was presented to him and start fighting back. He had no idea how far that decision would take him. The next morning, Jack woke at 3 a.m. and couldn't get back to sleep. He went to his garage and started researching HOA bylaws. He read through the entire Clearwater Springs covenant, took notes, made phone calls to a lawyer named Diana Reeves who specialized in HOA disputes. Diana was helpful, measured, and thoroughly disappointing. "You have grounds for complaint," she said over the phone. "The selective enforcement is a problem for them. But here's the thing, Jack, fighting an HOA is expensive, stressful, and even if you win, you lose. You'll still have to live here. You'll still have to see these people at the community pool. The animosity will fester." "So what do you recommend?" "Move the truck. It's not worth the legal fees alone, which could run 5 to 10 grand if this becomes adversarial. And believe me, Margaret Chen knows how to make things adversarial." Jack thanked her and hung up. He didn't move the truck. Instead, he attended the next HOA meeting. The meetings were held in the community center every second Thursday. Jack had only been to 2 in his 8 years at Clearwater Springs. They were boring, procedural, mostly about landscaping companies and pool maintenance. This one was different. Margaret Chen called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. 12 residents were in attendance, including Jack. She worked through the agenda quickly: landscape contractor renewal, a discussion about the new walking trail specifications, an upcoming book club event. Then, near the end, "We do have one ongoing compliance issue I wanted to address with the general membership. A resident has declined to remove a vehicle that violates our commercial vehicle covenant. We're exploring our enforcement options." She didn't name him, but everyone turned to look. Jack sat quietly, arms crossed. "Actually," Jack said, "I'd like to address that." Margaret's eyes did something cold, a little flash of something that looked like pleasure. "Of course." Jack stood. "The truck is a 2024 Ford F-150. It's not a commercial vehicle. It's registered as personal property. I have insurance on it as personal property. I'm a retired contractor, not a contractor currently operating a business. And more importantly, and I've checked this extensively, there are 6 other pickup trucks in this neighborhood, including a Silverado directly across from the HOA president's house, that have been parked in visible residential areas for months without violation letters." Margaret smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "Those vehicles are being handled on a case-by-case basis." "No," Jack said. "They're being ignored. The covenant says no commercial class vehicles." Either pickup trucks are prohibited or they're not. If they are, enforce it consistently. If they're not, then my truck stays. The committee has broad discretion. The committee has the responsibility to follow its own bylaws. I've had them reviewed by an attorney. The selective enforcement is actually grounds for me to file a complaint with the State Real Estate Commission. He sat down. The room was silent. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but her hands had gripped the edge of the podium a little tighter. We'll take this under advisement and communicate any decisions to all residents. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. As people filed out, 3 different neighbors came up to Jack and thanked him quietly. One of them, a woman named Susan, mentioned that her late-model Jeep Wrangler had been warned about last year. Walking to his car, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years. The satisfaction of standing up to someone who'd had it too easy for too long. He also felt a cold little voice in the back of his head, warning him that he'd just made an enemy. 2 weeks passed with no communication from the HOA. Jack parked the truck in his driveway and enjoyed it. He took it on drives through the mountains. He started learning about restoration work. He bought a few tools. Carol learned to make peace with the situation. Then on a Friday afternoon, Jack found a new letter in his mailbox. This one was printed on official Clearwater Springs HOA letterhead, dated and filed with the county clerk. Notice of covenant violation and intent to assess fine. Dear Mr. Morrison, you have failed to comply with the Architectural Control Committee's directive to remove your commercial class vehicle from visible residential parking areas. As of today's date, 1 month has passed since the initial warning letter. The committee is therefore assessing the first monthly fine of $100. Future violations will result in additional monthly fines. The committee also reserves the right to pursue legal remedies, which may include a lien against your property and/or pursuit of legal action through the county courts. This is an official record and has been filed with the county clerk's office. Sincerely, Margaret Chen, HOA President. Jack read the fine print 3 times. They could put a lien on his house, his paid-off house. The one he'd built, literally built on a subcontractor level to the specifications he and Carol had dreamed about for years. He set the letter down carefully and walked outside. The truck sat in his driveway, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Clean lines, powerful engine. Everything about it was perfectly legal, perfectly legitimate, perfectly his. Jack made a decision right then. If Margaret Chen wanted to play hardball, he could play harder. He went back inside and opened his laptop. By Monday morning, Jack had filed a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Commission against Margaret Chen and the HOA, documenting the selective enforcement of the covenant. He'd also started correspondence with Diana Reeves, his lawyer, who was now officially representing him in what she called pre-litigation communication. Diana sent a letter to the HOA's legal counsel, a firm called Whitmore and Associates that represented most of the HOA's legal matters, citing the violation of Fair Housing Act principles, the potential liability of selective enforcement, and the substantial legal fees that would accrue if the HOA forced this into a court proceeding. They'll probably back off now, Diana told him over the phone. Once they realize you're serious, they usually settle. But Margaret Chen didn't seem like the settling type. The response came 3 days later, another official letter, this one copied to Diana and filed with the county. The Architectural Control Committee maintains that the vehicle in question represents a material violation of the community covenant. The committee disputes allegations of selective enforcement and notes that other vehicles in question are either temporary contractor vehicles, requiring separate assessment, or maintained on properties where community standards compliance has been otherwise exemplary. The committee will not be moved by legal threats and will continue to pursue enforcement through all available legal remedies. Jack's hands were shaking as he read it. Carol watched from across the kitchen table, the expression on her face somewhere between concern and resignation. They're comparing you to your neighbors now, Carol said quietly, saying their compliance is better than yours. Their compliance? They painted their front door without approval. They have a hot tub that technically violates the pool regulations. Jack, Carol interrupted, you need to think about what you're actually fighting here. This isn't about the truck anymore. She was right. He knew she was right. But But something in him had crystallized. Some old stubbornness that had served him well in the contracting business. That refusal to accept injustice, that willingness to spend money and time and emotional capital on principle. What he didn't understand yet was that principle and practicality don't always occupy the same space. He scheduled a meeting with Diana in person. Her office was downtown, 30 minutes from Clearwater Springs, in a professional building that smelled like coffee and leather furniture. Diana was in her 50s, sharp, and possessed the kind of calm competence that Jack recognized from his years of hearing good people. "I want to fight this," Jack told her, "all the way if necessary. It will be expensive. I don't care about the money." Diana nodded slowly, as if she'd heard this before and knew how it usually ended. "Here's the situation. You have a good case for selective enforcement. The HOA violated their own bylaws by treating your truck differently than identical vehicles in the neighborhood. That's documented. That's solid. A judge would likely see it your way. So we file." "Could, but here's what happens next. The HOA has insurance for this kind of thing. They'll hire an attorney from Whitmore and Associates, a firm that does 50 of these cases a year. They'll file motions. They'll drag this out. 18 months, probably 2 years. It'll cost you $30,000 to $40,000 in legal fees, and it'll cost the HOA maybe $5,000 because their insurance covers it. In the end, you win, they pay some money, and you still have to look at Margaret Chen at the grocery store. What's your recommendation?" "Ordinarily, I'd say move the truck and move on with your life. But," Diana leaned forward, "you don't seem like the moving on type. So here's what I think you should do. You should make them understand that fighting you is more expensive than backing down." "How do I do that?" "You make noise. You file that complaint with the State Real Estate Commission, which you've already done. You file complaints with the county. You reach out to local news. HOAs hate publicity. They hate the kind of attention that makes people question whether their neighborhood's rules are reasonable. If enough people start asking questions, if enough media attention gets focused on Margaret's selective enforcement, she'll fold. They always fold when it becomes a public relations problem." Jack leaned back in his chair. "So you want me to go to the press?" "I want you to let your attorney know that you're prepared to, and I want me to write that in official correspondence to Whitmore and Associates. Let them know that the default is media attention and state complaints unless this gets resolved amicably." Diana drafted the letter that afternoon. Jack paid her invoice, $400 for 3 hours of work, and drove back to Clearwater Springs. That night, he called local news stations. The first 3 didn't care. Some guy fighting his HOA over a truck. That wasn't news. That was just suburban drama, and suburban drama was plentiful and boring. The 4th call connected him with a producer at Channel 7 named Marcus Webb. "So you've got a pickup truck, and your HOA doesn't like it," Marcus said, his voice pitched in that way that suggested he was already mentally filing this story under nothing. "I've got a pickup truck, and they're selectively enforcing their rules. 7 other pickup trucks in the neighborhood, including one owned by the HOA president, are parked in residential areas without violations. Mine is the only one they're fining. It's discriminatory." A pause. Jack could almost hear Marcus's interest shift. "Are you documenting this?" "I've got photographs, dates, vehicle registrations, everything." "Send it to me. If the numbers check out, we might have something." Jack sent the documentation packet at 11 p.m. that night. At 6:47 a.m. the next morning, Marcus called back. "Can you be available for an interview this afternoon? We want to get some B-roll of the truck, your neighborhood, some shots of the HOA president's house, and that Silverado she's apparently not bothered by." Carol was making breakfast when Jack hung up the phone. She looked at him with an expression that mixed understanding with dread. "You're going on the news." "Yes." "Margaret Chen is going to lose her mind." "Probably." "And after this, you're going to have to live in this neighborhood with someone who hates you." Jack poured himself a cup of coffee. "The alternative is accepting that she gets to make arbitrary rules and punish me for not following them while ignoring everyone else. I spent 40 years running a business, Carol. I spent 40 years dealing with inspectors and permitting boards and people with power who used it badly. I don't have another 40 years in me to just accept that." Carol was quiet for a long moment, then she kissed him on the forehead. "Make sure you look good on camera." The interview was at 2 p.m. in Jack's driveway, with the truck positioned prominently in the frame. Marcus was a professional, asking leading questions that helped Jack explain the situation clearly. Did Jack feel that the HOA was treating him unfairly? Yes. Did he have evidence of other similar vehicles that weren't being fined? Yes. Had he attempted to resolve this through official channels? Yes. What did he hope would happen? He hoped the HOA would apply its rules consistently and fairly. The cameraman got shots of Jack's truck, shots of the street, and then, this was the key part, shots of Margaret Chen's house and the Silverado parked on the street across from it. "We'll edit this tonight," Marcus told him. "It'll run on the evening news and online." Jack felt something between exhilaration and terror. The piece ran at 6 p.m. "Local man battles unfair HOA enforcement," the headline read. The story was presented fairly, not sensationalized, but clear. Jack's situation was contrasted with the HOA president's own apparent exemption from the rules. They even got a quote from one of the other residents Jack had identified, a woman named Patricia Summers, who said her vehicle had also been warned about, while others went unmentioned. By 7 p.m., Jack's phone had started ringing. Neighbors, reporters from other outlets wanting follow-up stories. Someone from an HOA reform advocacy group asking if he'd be willing to speak at a community forum. By 8 p.m., Margaret Chen was calling. "What in God's name did you do?" she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Do you understand what you've just done? Do you understand the liability you've created for me, for the entire community?" "I've exposed selective rule enforcement," Jack said quietly. "That's what I've done. You've made me look like a hypocrite. You've made this community look like we're a joke. Do you have any idea how many complaints I'm already getting from residents? How many people are asking about that Silverado? Then maybe you should address that with consistent enforcement." She hung up. 30 seconds later, Diana Reeves called. "I've got Whitmore and Associates on the line. They want to discuss a settlement." "What kind of settlement?" "The full withdrawal of the complaint. All fines waived. A written statement from the HOA acknowledging that your truck is not in violation of the covenant. In exchange, you agree not to pursue any additional legal action and agree to remove your cooperation with the media." Jack felt something like victory warming his chest. "Tell them I want an apology. A written apology from Margaret Chen acknowledging the selective enforcement." "Jack, they're not going to." "Then we don't have a settlement." Diana was quiet for a moment. "I'll see what I can do." The response came the next morning. The apology was off the table. The HOA would waive the fines and issue a statement that Jack's truck was not in violation, but there would be no admission of selective enforcement and no personal apology from Margaret Chen. Jack agreed to the settlement. It felt like a win, mostly. But something about it didn't sit right. Something about Margaret's phone call, the trembling fury in her voice, the sense that he'd humiliated her publicly, suggested that this wasn't over. That this was just a ceasefire. He didn't know that Margaret Chen was the kind of woman who didn't forget insults, who didn't forgive public embarrassment, who kept mental lists of people who'd crossed her and waited for the right moment to cross back. He didn't know that she was already on the phone with other board members, already planning her response. And he definitely didn't know what shape that response would take. 3 weeks of peace. Jack parked his truck in his driveway and didn't receive a single letter. The HOA issued the statement that the truck was in compliance. News outlets moved on to other stories. The advocacy group that had called him found another case to champion. Jack started focusing on his retirement plans in earnest. He spent time with his truck, learning about the restoration process. He taught himself woodworking in his garage. He and Carol took walks in the evenings around their neighborhood, and he actually started to relax. He'd won, he'd stood up to arbitrary authority and come out on top. This was the story he told himself. Carol seemed relieved too. The tension in the house had dissipated. They'd stopped having quiet arguments about whether Jack had done the right thing. They started making plans for travel, for renovations to the guest room, for a new life together without the stress of Jack's business. Then on a Tuesday morning, a new letter arrived. This one wasn't about the truck. "Dear Mr. Morrison, during a routine inspection of neighborhood properties, the Architectural Control Committee has identified several potential covenant violations on your property at 44 Clearwater Lane. These include 1. Your exterior paint color, which may not match approved specifications. 2. Your landscaping, which appears to exceed approved tree density for residential properties. 3. Potential installation of non-approved exterior lighting. 4. Your mailbox, which does not appear to conform to HOA-approved designs. And 5. Possible gravel pebble material in your landscaping that exceeds approved percentages. The committee is requesting that you provide documentation showing compliance with all of the above within 14 days. Failure to do so will result in violation notices and fines beginning at $100 per violation. Sincerely, Margaret Chen, HOA President. Jack read the letter 4 times. Each time he felt something cold spreading through his chest. The house was painted the same taupe that it had been since they moved in. Carol had chosen the color specifically from the approved palette of HOA colors. The landscaping had been the same for 8 years, 5 trees exactly. The mailbox was the exact model the HOA had approved, purchased from the recommended vendor. The lighting hadn't changed. The pebbles were standard decorative rock. "They're coming after you," Diana Reeves said when he called her that morning. "This is retaliation, classic retaliation for the media attention." Can they do this? They can do it. Whether it sticks is another question. But Jack, this is how these things escalate. They're going to find things or invent them until they can document enough violations that the cost of fighting becomes prohibitive. "That's insane." "That's HOAs," Diana said flatly. "I warned you about this. I told you that you'd win the battle, but the relationship would stay broken." "So what do I do?" "You document everything. You get exterior photos taken by a professional showing your house matches approved specifications. You get receipts and documentation for every item they're questioning, and you prepare for a long fight." Jack spent that afternoon photographing everything. The paint color, the landscaping, the mailbox, the lighting. He dug through 8 years of receipts and HOA approvals. He found the email where they'd specifically approved the mailbox model. He found the original landscape plan signed off by the Architectural Control Committee. By evening, he had a complete file. He responded to Margaret's letter with a point-by-point rebuttal, attaching documentation for everything. The response came 5 days later. Upon further review of submitted documentation, the committee notes that while the items listed above may have historical approval, recent committee standards have evolved. Several items are now considered non-compliant with updated guidelines. Specifically, the mailbox design, while previously approved, no longer meets current aesthetic standards. The tree density, while technically within limits, creates a visual impact inconsistent with neighborhood character. The committee is assessing violations as follows: mailbox noncompliance, $100, landscape aesthetic violation, $100, potential lighting noncompliance pending further inspection, $100. These fines total $300 and are due within 14 days. "They changed their standards retroactively," Jack said to Diana, his voice tight. "They're fining me for things that were approved at the time." "I know. Can they do that?" "It's a gray area legally. A judge might see it as retroactive enforcement, which is generally prohibited. But that means another lawsuit, more legal fees, more of your life spent on this." "So what are you suggesting?" Diana was quiet for a moment. "I'm suggesting you consider the long-term cost-benefit. You can fight this and probably win, but it's going to be 6 months to a year of stress, legal fees, and living in an increasingly hostile environment. Or you can move." Jack felt something break in his chest. He'd built this house. He'd chosen it specifically, every detail with Carol. They'd planned to grow old here. "I'm not moving." "Then prepare for war." Over the next 2 months, the violations escalated. The committee found that his driveway's sealant was unapproved. They claimed his garden hose wasn't properly stored. They said his trash cans were visible from the street for too long during collection day. They should have been put out no earlier than 6 a.m. and brought in by 7 p.m. They issued a violation for having a ladder leaning against the side of the house for 1 day while Jack cleaned gutters. Each violation came with a $100 fine. The fines accumulated. By month 2, Jack owed $1,200. Carol started asking about moving. "This has to end at some point," she said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking exhausted. "We can't live like this. every day wondering what new violation they're going to find. I'm not letting them win, Carol. It's not about winning anymore. It's about us. It's about our life. Don't you want to just have peace? Jack did want peace. He wanted it desperately. But he couldn't accept capitulation. Couldn't accept that if you stood up for yourself, they'd just keep coming at you until you gave up. He called Diana again. I want to file a harassment lawsuit. I want to go after them for intentional infliction of emotional distress, selective enforcement, and retaliation. That's expensive, Jack, and it might not work. HOAs have broad legal protections. I don't care. I'm done playing defense. Diana filed the lawsuit the next week. The lawsuit claimed that the HOA's recent enforcement actions constituted harassment and retaliation for Jack's media appearance, and the previous complaint against the selective enforcement. It sought damages in the amount of $50,000 and an injunction preventing future violations from being issued. Whitmore and Associates responded 3 days later with a motion to dismiss, arguing that HOA enforcement actions were protected actions and that Jack's allegations didn't meet the legal threshold for harassment. It was going to be a long, expensive fight. Jack had spent $18,000 in legal fees by this point. His insurance didn't cover HOA disputes. He was paying out of pocket, and Carol was starting to look at real estate websites in other cities. Then something unexpected happened. A woman named Ellen Rodriguez, who lived 2 streets over, called Diana's office and asked if she could speak to Jack. Ellen had been on the HOA board for 3 years before resigning 6 months ago. She called Jack and asked to meet him at a coffee shop away from the neighborhood. I quit because of Margaret, Ellen told him quietly, sitting across from him in a Starbucks downtown. She's created an environment where the board just does what she wants. No dissenting opinions, no checks and balances. I watched her bully people off the board who disagreed with her, and I realized I didn't want to be part of it anymore. Why are you telling me this? Because what she's doing to you is exactly what she did to 3 other homeowners who crossed her. She finds violations. She escalates them until they either move or back down. She's done this before. Can you testify to that? I want to. I know what she is, and I don't want to see another person destroyed by her power trips. Ellen became Jack's key witness. With Ellen's testimony, documenting the pattern of escalating violations against homeowners who'd challenged Margaret or the board, Diana's case suddenly got stronger. Whitmore and Associates' confidence seemed to shift. Their next filing was less aggressive. Then they requested a settlement conference. At the settlement conference, 3 weeks later, Margaret Chen was present. She looked smaller than Jack remembered, older, but her eyes still had that cold light to them. You've caused me considerable difficulty, she said to Jack directly, ignoring Diana's attempts to keep the conversation between attorneys. I've documented violations against your selective enforcement, Jack replied. That's not causing you difficulty, that's holding you accountable. This is a community I've built, Margaret said, her voice tight with emotion that Jack hadn't expected. I've worked for 15 years to make Clearwater Springs a place people are proud to live in, and you've made me look like a villain in the eyes of my neighbors. Jack felt something shift in him, a moment of understanding, not sympathy, but understanding, that Margaret wasn't a villain. She was a woman who'd conflated her power with her identity, who'd believed so thoroughly in her own righteousness that any challenge to her authority felt like an attack on her person. I wasn't trying to damage you, Jack said carefully. I was trying to be treated fairly. And now look at us, Margaret said. We're destroying each other over a truck. The settlement offer came an hour later, full withdrawal of all violations, waiver of all fines owed. A written apology from the HOA acknowledging that enforcement actions subsequent to the media attention were excessive and disproportionate. In exchange, Jack would withdraw his harassment lawsuit and agree not to pursue any further legal action against the HOA. Jack accepted. It was a complete victory, everything he'd wanted. But driving home with Diana, something didn't feel right, something about the ease of it. The way Margaret had looked at him in that conference room, not defeated but calculating. Like a player who'd just thrown a hand at poker and was already thinking about the next game. He didn't know yet what she was planning. Jack was in his garage, measuring wood for a bookshelf, when Carol came out with her phone. Her face had that expression it got when she was reading something that didn't make sense. "You need to see this," she said. The email was from a property management company that specialized in commercial real estate. The subject line read, "Inquiry regarding 44 Clearwater Lane. Dear Mr. Morrison, our client is developing a commercial property expansion project in the Clearwater Springs area and has identified your residential property as potentially suitable for rezoning and development. We're reaching out to gauge your interest in selling at a market premium. Our client is prepared to offer $680,000 for your property, which is approximately $120,000 above current market value. Please indicate your interest in discussing this further. Our client prefers to move quickly on this acquisition." Jack read it 3 times. He and Carol had paid $480,000 for the house 11 years ago. Current market value was around $560,000. An offer of $680,000 was substantial. Also completely suspicious. "Is this real?" Carol asked. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Jack called the property management company. A man named Robert Chen answered. "Carol's related." Jack asked, but Robert said no, just a common name. "I'm calling about the inquiry regarding my property," Jack said. "Wonderful. Yes, we've been authorized to make a substantial offer for your property. Our client is quite interested in acquiring residential properties in the Clearwater Springs area for a mixed-use development project." "What kind of development project?" "We don't have all the details on the client's end yet, but it's a significant commercial initiative. The reason for the above-market offer is that they're looking to assemble multiple properties in quick succession." Jack felt something cold settling in his stomach. "I'm not interested in selling," he said. "I'd encourage you to discuss it with your wife before." "I'm not interested." He hung up and called Diana immediately. "It's probably a coincidence," Diana said. "It's not a coincidence, it's Margaret." "Jack, you don't know that." "She called me into a settlement conference. She apologized, she backed down. And now some property development company is trying to buy my house above market value? That's not coincidence, that's retaliation." Diana was quiet for a moment. "Even if it is, I'm not sure what you think she's doing. If someone's trying to develop property in your neighborhood, that's not her fault. That's market forces." But Jack's mind was already working on it. If Margaret had connections, and someone who'd run an HOA for 15 years would have connections, she could have reached out to a development company, offered information about which properties might be available, suggested that Jack might be willing to sell if the price was right. That's not illegal, that's networking. But it felt like another form of the same campaign. The same message: leave, go, stop being here. He called Robert Chen back. "Tell your client I'm not selling. Perhaps you'd like to consider the offer." "I'm not interested in any offer, now or in the future. Please don't contact me again." He hung up and tried not to think about the fact that he'd just rejected $680,000. Carol didn't bring it up, but he could see her thinking about it. Could see her calculating what that money would mean: retirement in a better location, travel, freedom from this stress. That night, Jack made a decision. He was going to prove that Margaret was behind this. He was going to document it, and if necessary, he was going to drag her into it publicly again. He started with research. He found articles about property development in the county. He looked for news about commercial projects being planned near Clearwater Springs. He searched for the property management company's website and tried to find information about their client. The client was listed as Horizon Development LLC, a Delaware corporation. That's where the trail went cold. But Jack knew someone who could help. Ellen Rodriguez's husband was a title attorney. Jack called Ellen and asked if he could speak to her husband. Marcus Rodriguez agreed to meet with Jack at his office, and after some phone calls and record searches, he found something. Horizon Development LLC's registered agent was based in Delaware, but the mailing address used for tax purposes was in California. However, the LLC had received significant funding, over $2 million in capital injection, from a holding company based locally. "Give me 2 weeks," Marcus said. "I can probably trace the actual ownership, but it requires some digging." 2 weeks passed, then Marcus called. "I found something," he said quietly. Horizon Development LLC's parent holding company, the one that funded them, is owned by a guy named Thomas Chen, Margaret Chen's ex-husband. He owns several commercial real estate companies. He definitely has the resources to make this play. Jack felt the pieces clicking into place. So Margaret contacted her ex-husband and got him to try to buy my house. That's the logical conclusion, though obviously you can't prove they coordinated specifically on this. But if Horizon Development LLC is trying to assemble properties, and you're being approached with an above-market offer, it's reasonable to conclude there's a connection. What can I do about it? Legally, almost nothing. It's not illegal for Margaret to know her ex-husband. It's not illegal for her ex-husband to develop property. It's not illegal for a development company to make an offer on a house. You'd have a hard time proving coordination, and even if you did, I'm not sure it would rise to the level of a legal violation. Jack felt something like rage building in his chest. Not just anger, but the specific kind of rage that comes from understanding you've been outmaneuvered. He called Diana. I want to go back to court. I want to say that the HOA president is using her connections to try to force me out of my house as retaliation for the media coverage. Jack, you can't prove that. I can prove the connection between Margaret Chen and Horizon Development, LLC. You can prove that Margaret Chen has an ex-husband who happens to own a company that's making offers on properties in your area. That's not evidence of retaliation. That's coincidence. It's not coincidence. I know it's not, Diana said, and her voice had a note of something like pity. But legally, it's circumstantial at best. You'd spend another $20,000, $30,000 trying to prove it and probably lose. Jack hung up and sat in his garage for 2 hours, not thinking about anything, just existing in a state of impotent fury. By the time he came inside, he'd made another decision. If Margaret wanted to play by different rules, he would too. That night, Jack went online and found a commercial real estate listing service. He created an account and posted a detailed listing of commercial property in Clearwater Springs, not his house, but the community common area with detailed specifications about its location, square footage, and potential development value. He made the listing look official. He priced it at $5 million. Then he sent a copy of the listing to every commercial real estate company in the state. By the next morning, Horizon Development LLC had received it and immediately reached out about the property. Robert Chen called Jack directly. This listing is showing the common area of a residential community. That's not a commercial property. No, but it's available if your client is interested in development, Jack said calmly. I imagine your client would love to have access to premium property in Clearwater Springs. This is not legitimate. Neither was trying to buy my house through your client. Jack hung up. It was a small revenge, petty even, but it felt good. He waited for the next escalation, but it didn't come. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then on a Friday, Margaret Chen called him personally. I need to see you, she said. Not through lawyers, just you and me. Why would I agree to that? Because I think we're both tired of this, and I think there might be a way to end it that doesn't require either of us to hurt the other anymore. Jack almost said no, almost hung up and told her to go through Diana. But something in her voice made him reconsider, something that sounded like actual exhaustion, actual defeat. Where, he asked. The park on Maple Street, tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. They met at the park, on a bench overlooking a man-made pond that was part of the neighborhood's amenities. Margaret looked smaller in person without the authority of the HOA boardroom. She looked tired. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. Not the official kind that I was forced to give, a real one. Jack waited. When you went to the media, I felt humiliated. I felt like you'd made me a villain in my own community, and I reacted badly. I called Thomas because I knew he had property interests in the area, and I asked him to make an offer on your house. I thought if you sold and moved, the whole situation would go away and I could rebuild my reputation. That's a terrible thing to do, Jack said. I know. You tried to force me out of my house because I embarrassed you. I know, Margaret said again, and her voice had tears in it. And it worked for a while, didn't it? You've been miserable. You and your wife, I've been miserable. Everyone in this community has been uncomfortable. And for what? Because I was too proud to admit I'd been unfair to you. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't expected. A woman who was genuinely sorry, but also genuinely trapped by her own need to be right, to be powerful, to be in control. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to let this go. I want to resign from the HOA. I'm going to tell the board that I'm stepping down effective immediately, and I'm going to recommend that they implement new policies to prevent this kind of selective enforcement from happening again. And I'm going to ask you, not require, ask, to please stop escalating this." Jack thought about the last 6 months, the legal fees, the stress, the way it had poisoned his retirement, his peace, his life with Carol. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm genuinely afraid of what happens if you don't," Margaret said quietly. "I'm afraid that you'll keep coming after me, and I'll keep retaliating, and eventually we'll hurt each other so badly that there's no coming back from it. I have a daughter who lives in this community, 2 grandchildren. I don't want them to see their grandmother becoming someone so consumed by spite that she's willing to destroy other people just to avoid admitting she was wrong." It was the most honest thing she'd said, Jack thought. It was the moment when he realized that winning and losing were more complicated concepts than he'd understood them to be. He extended his hand. "I accept your resignation." Margaret shook it. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 people who'd tried to destroy each other coming to understand that destruction had no winner. "I'll tell Thomas to stop," Margaret said. "He'll stop, the offers will end." "I know," Jack said. As Margaret left, she turned back once. "Your truck is nice, by the way." Jack smiled despite everything. "Thanks." He drove back to his house and found Carol in the garden, planting winter flowers. "What happened?" she asked, seeing something in his face. "I think it's over," Jack said. Carol set down her gardening tools and came to embrace him. "Really?" "Really?" But that night, as Jack lay in bed listening to the silence of their neighborhood, he kept thinking about something Margaret had said. "I'm afraid you'll keep coming after me, and I'll keep retaliating." Because he hadn't planned to stop. He'd been planning his next move, planning how to escalate, planning how to leverage what he'd learned about Thomas Chen into some kind of public pressure. Margaret had stopped first, had stepped back from the brink first. And that made him understand something uncomfortable about himself, that he'd been just as willing as Margaret had been to let this spiral into something destructive, that he'd had his own version of her pride, her need to be right, her refusal to lose. The only difference was that she'd woken up to it first. The next morning, Margaret announced her resignation at an emergency board meeting. The HOA issued a statement that they would be implementing new enforcement policies and procedures designed to prevent selective enforcement and ensure consistent application of all community rules. The media picked it up. "HOA president resigns following truck controversy," the headline read. And that should have been the end of it. But Jack didn't know that Margaret's resignation would set off a chain of events that would change everything. That other board members had concerns. That Ellen Rodriguez would come forward with information about board malfeasance. That investigations would be launched into how the HOA had been managed for the past 15 years. And he definitely didn't know what Margaret herself was planning to do next. 3 months after Margaret's resignation, Jack got a call from Ellen Rodriguez. "You need to come to the board meeting tonight," she said. "There's something you should hear." Jack attended the meeting with Diana. The new HOA president, a man named James Martinez, was presenting the results of an external audit of the HOA's finances and operations over the past 15 years. The findings were damning. Margaret Chen had not been embezzling money exactly, but she had been directing community funds to contractors and vendors that she had financial interests in. She'd approved expensive projects that nobody else had voted on. She'd used HOA money to pay for administration costs that turned out to be personal expenses. Over 15 years, she'd essentially stolen approximately $187,000 from the community through creative accounting and abuse of her authority. "The board is pursuing legal action," James Martinez announced. "We're also notifying residents that we'll be implementing significant policy reforms." Jack listened to the rest of the meeting in a state of shock. After it ended, Ellen pulled him aside. "She's going to be charged," Ellen said quietly. "The board voted to report her to the county prosecutor. They're looking at fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct." Serious charges. Potentially, she could face jail time if they proved deliberate fraud rather than just negligent accounting. Jack felt something complicated move through him. Margaret had been corrupt. She'd been abusing her power financially in addition to abusing it socially and procedurally. She'd been stealing from the community. She deserved consequences. But he also remembered her sitting on that bench, telling him she was afraid of what would happen if the cycle didn't break. He called Diana from the parking lot. "I want to speak to Margaret before the charges are filed," he said. "Jack, I don't think. I need to talk to her." Ellen gave him Margaret's number. Margaret answered on the third ring. She sounded like she'd been crying. "How did you find out?" she asked before he could say anything. "Ellen told me about the audit." "They're going to destroy me," Margaret said, and her voice had a flatness to it that suggested she'd moved beyond fear into acceptance. "They're going to charge me with crimes. They're going to." "I know," Jack said gently. "Why are you calling me?" "Because I want to tell you that I didn't do this. I don't know how much you know about the circumstances that led to the audit, but I wasn't involved. I'm not the reason they found the financial misconduct." There was a long silence on the other end. "But you're glad they found it," Margaret said finally. "You're glad I'm being destroyed." "I'm not glad," Jack said honestly. "I'm not glad, I'm sad. I think you messed up in really significant ways, and I think there are consequences for that. But I'm not glad." "Will you testify against me?" Margaret asked. "Only if I have to. I don't want to." Another silence. Jack could almost hear her processing that. "I talked to Thomas," Margaret said. "I told him to pull any offers on your house, to abandon the whole thing. I wrote you an apology. Did you get it?" "I got it," Jack said. They had received a handwritten letter, sealed and formal, apologizing for the attempted purchase and acknowledging it as an inappropriate retaliation. "I was trying to make things right," Margaret said, and her voice broke. "After I realized what I'd done to you, I was trying to be better. And now I find out I've been doing these other things for so long that I didn't even realize what they were." "What do you mean?" "The financial stuff. I never saw it as stealing. I saw it as, I don't know, normal, like this was how business was done, how HOAs were run. But when they showed me the numbers, when I actually looked at what I'd done, I realized I was a criminal. I'm a criminal, Jack. I've been a criminal." Jack didn't know what to say to that. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I'm going to cooperate with the investigation. I'm going to return as much money as I can. I'm probably going to lose my house. I'm going to face charges, and I'm going to accept it because it's what I deserve." After they hung up, Jack sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time, thinking about justice, about consequences, about how a person's life can unravel when all the threads of misconduct finally get pulled. He wondered if this was what he'd wanted when he first called that news station, if he'd unconsciously known that fighting Margaret would lead to this. That night, the prosecutor filed charges against Margaret Chen for embezzlement and financial fraud. The case made local news, not as big a story as the truck controversy, but significant enough. "Former HOA president charged in financial misconduct case," the headline read. Some of Jack's neighbors reached out to congratulate him, called it justice, called it karma. But Jack didn't feel like celebrating. He was thinking about the complexity of it all, about how Margaret had been corrupt and also vulnerable, about how he'd been right to push back against her unfair enforcement and also unwilling to stop when the reasonable endpoint came and went. About how sometimes when you push someone hard enough, and you have enough allies and you're willing to embarrass them publicly, all their secrets come out, not because you were looking for them, but as a side effect of the damage. A month later, Diana called him. "The prosecutor wants to offer Margaret a plea deal. She'll plead guilty to 1 count of embezzlement, a felony, and enter into restitution payments of $187,000. She'll face a suspended sentence if she completes 5 years of probation without incident." "Is that a good deal for her?" Jack asked. "It's the best deal she could get. Without it, they'd go to trial, she'd probably lose, and she'd face up to 10 years in prison. So yes, it's good." "Is she taking it?" "She has until Friday to decide." The prosecutor asked if you'd be willing to provide a character statement, not to excuse her actions, but to speak to her willingness to cooperate and make amends since the fraudulent conduct ended. Jack thought about that. Tell them yes, he said. But tell them I want it made clear that my statement is about her recent actions and her cooperation with the investigation. It's not about the harassment. It's not about what she did to me. He wrote the statement that night. He spoke about how Margaret had resigned, how she'd reached out to him personally, how she'd seemed genuinely remorseful when she'd realized the scope of her misconduct. It wasn't forgiveness, it was just honesty. Margaret took the plea deal. She faced sentencing in juvenile court. The judge, reviewing her cooperation and her age and the character statements submitted on her behalf, gave her the suspended sentence. She would face 10 years of probation, during which time she'd make restitution payments to the HOA. She sold her house to cover the first installment of the restitution. She moved away from Clearwater Springs. Jack heard, through Ellen, that she'd moved to Portland to be closer to her daughter and grandchildren, that she'd taken a job as an administrative assistant for a nonprofit, that she was working to rebuild her life in a place where she wasn't defined by her mistakes. Life in Clearwater Springs gradually returned to normal. The new HOA board implemented the reforms they'd promised. There were fewer violations issued. The enforcement became more consistent. The community actually seemed healthier without Margaret's iron-fisted control. Jack parked his truck in his driveway, and nobody complained. He finished his restoration project. He took Carol on the trips they'd planned. He started sleeping better at night. But sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd think about the whole arc of it. How he'd been right to fight an unjust rule. How he'd been justified in pushing back against selective enforcement. How he'd been correct in every step of the escalation. And how the end result had been watching a woman's life fall apart in a way that went far beyond the original conflict. He'd won, he'd stood up to arbitrary authority. He'd won vindication from the media, from his lawyer, from his community. But what had he actually won? A truck in his driveway. A woman in exile from her community. A community that felt safer, sure, but that had also learned that if you challenged the wrong person, everything came out. All the corruption, all the misconduct, all the skeletons that everyone had been quietly accepting. Carol found him on the driveway one evening, standing next to the truck, thinking about nothing in particular. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, "I'm okay." "You don't seem okay." Jack thought about how to explain it, how to articulate the strange, empty feeling that came after you've won a fight you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. "I'm wondering if I did the right thing," he said finally. "With what?" "With Margaret, with the whole thing." Carol took his hand. "You did fight for what was fair, the truck thing that was fair. That was you standing up to an unfair rule. But everything that came after, that wasn't your fault. You didn't make Margaret steal money. You didn't force her to be corrupt. But if I hadn't escalated it, then you would have accepted injustice. You would have let an unfair system continue. And Margaret would still have been stealing money. She'd just be doing it for another 15 years while everyone pretended not to see it." Carol squeezed his hand. "Sometimes," she said, "pulling the thread doesn't just unravel the system that was crushing you. It unravels all the other systems that were hidden underneath. And that's not your responsibility." Jack wanted to believe that, wanted to accept that he hadn't caused this, that he'd simply exposed something that was already wrong. But he also understood, in a way he hadn't before, that in a small community, in any community, every action had consequences that extended far beyond the original conflict. That fighting one injustice could expose others. That justice wasn't a simple equation. That sometimes being right meant you had to live with complicated feelings about what your rightness had cost. The next day, Jack received a letter in the mail. It was forwarded from his old address and had been in transit for several weeks. It was from Margaret, written in careful handwriting. "Dear Jack, I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months. I have a lot of regret about what I did, not just to you, but to this community. I'm working with a therapist to understand how I became someone who would abuse power the way I did. It's not an excuse, but it's the work I'm doing. I also want to acknowledge that I created the circumstances where my corruption would be exposed. By being so focused on controlling everything and everyone, I made myself vulnerable to the kind of scrutiny that comes when you've made an enemy. You didn't find those financial records. The board did as a result of the general audit. But I know that if you hadn't challenged me on the truck, there would have been no general audit. You opened the door. Your fight exposed me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm taking responsibility for my actions, all of them. And I wanted to tell you that I think, ultimately, you did the right thing. You stood up to something unfair. The fact that it led to exposing other unfair things doesn't diminish that you were right to do it. My daughter told me something helpful. The truth is what it is, and it's not your fault that I was hiding from it. I'm trying to believe that about my situation. That what happened wasn't your fault. It was the inevitable consequence of someone like me being in power while doing the things I was doing. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for the corruption. I'm sorry for using my connections to try to force you to move. And I'm grateful, in a strange way, that you pushed back hard enough that I couldn't hide anymore. I hope you and your wife are happy in your home. Sincerely, Margaret. Jack read the letter 3 times. He showed it to Carol. What do you think? He asked. I think she's doing the work, Carol said. I think she's trying to be better. That's all anyone can do. Jack kept the letter. He didn't frame it or put it in a special place, but he kept it. He'd won his fight. He'd stood up to arbitrary authority. He'd exposed corruption. He'd changed his HOA for the better. And the cost, to Margaret, to himself, to his community's peace, was complicated and real, and not something he could simply wave away as irrelevant. He'd learned that justice isn't as simple as being right. Sometimes it's just as much about understanding what your rightness costs other people. And sometimes the real victory is knowing the difference. 6 months after Margaret's sentencing, Clearwater Springs had settled into a new normal. The HOA was functioning well under James Martinez's leadership. The board had term limits now, ethics guidelines, financial oversight committees. The violations stopped coming at arbitrary intervals. Life was peaceful. Jack was in his garage on a Saturday afternoon when Carol called him inside. "Someone's here to see you," she said, and her voice had an uncertainty that told him who it was before he even came in. Margaret Chen stood in his living room, looking smaller than he remembered. She was thinner now, and her hair had more gray. She wore simple clothes, no HOA President Power suit, no jewelry of significance. Just a woman who'd been stripped down by consequence and was trying to rebuild. Jack wanted to turn around and walk back to his garage. He didn't. "I'm sorry to drop in," Margaret said. "I know this is inappropriate. Ellen Rodriguez gave me your address. I'm back in town for a few days visiting my daughter. I wanted to see the community to remind myself that it exists without me." "Why?" Jack asked. "Because it's important to me. Because even though I treated it as my kingdom, it wasn't. It belonged to everyone, and I wanted to see that it's okay without me destroying it." Jack gestured to the living room. "Sit." They sat across from each other, and Carol excused herself with a careful look that said she was available if he needed her, but respecting that this was between them. "How are you?" Jack asked. "I'm working. I'm paying restitution. I'm going to therapy. I'm learning to live with who I was and who I'm trying to be. It's not easy." "No," Jack agreed. "I imagine it's not." "I wanted to thank you," Margaret said. "I know that seems strange. You fought me. You exposed me. You didn't save me. I did a pretty good job of destroying myself. But you gave me the opportunity to stop lying about who I was." "I wasn't trying to help you," Jack said honestly. "I know, but the result was the same. When you pushed back against me about the truck, it forced me to look at myself. And when I looked, I started seeing things I'd been hiding from for years. Not just the financial stuff, that was obvious when I actually looked, but the way I'd been treating people, the way I'd confused power with righteousness." Margaret looked around Jack's living room. "This is a nice house. You chose well." "Thank you." "I would have been furious if you'd sold it," Margaret continued. "I would have taken that as victory, but I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad you stood your ground." Jack didn't know what to say to that. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Margaret said, echoing her letter. "I'm asking you to know that I'm taking responsibility, that I understand what I did wasn't just to you, but to a whole community, and I'm trying to be different." She stood to leave. "Are you happy?" she asked at the door. "In your house with your truck in your life?" Jack thought about the past year, about the stress and the fighting and the escalation, about the moment when he'd won and found out that winning felt more complicated than he'd expected. Yes, he said, I'm happy. Good, Margaret said. That makes it worth it. After she left, Carol came back into the room and sat next to Jack on the couch. How are you feeling? She asked. I don't know, Jack said honestly. I'm glad she's trying to change. I'm also tired of the whole thing. I just want to move forward. You can, Carol said. It's over now. It's actually over. And it was. The HOA violations ended. Margaret moved back to Portland. The community stabilized. Jack's life returned to the quiet retirement he'd been looking for when he bought that truck. He spent his days in his garage, working on restoration projects. He took Carol on trips. He reconnected with old friends from the contracting business. He joined a fishing club and started taking regular trips to mountain streams. His truck sat in his driveway, a reminder of the fight he'd won and the complicated victory that had come with it. A year and a half later, Jack got a call from Ellen Rodriguez. I wanted you to know, Ellen said, that Margaret just paid off the last of her restitution. She's finished with probation next month. Good for her, Jack said, and he meant it. She asked me to tell you something. She said I should let you know that she's started a nonprofit helping people who have been in situations like hers, people who have abused power and want to change. She's calling it the Second Chance Initiative. Jack didn't know what to say to that. She said she knew you'd think it was ironic, Ellen continued, that she of all people was giving second chances, but she said that's exactly why she needed to do it. That understanding how hard it is to rebuild after you've lost everything made her want to help other people do the same. After Ellen hung up, Jack sat on his driveway next to his truck and thought about that. He'd been right to fight her. The rules she'd enforced had been arbitrary and unjust. His truck had been a legitimate object of ownership and pride. But the victory had come with collateral damage, not just to Margaret, but to the whole community, which had had to reckon with what its trusted leader had been doing behind the scenes. And yet, on the other side of all that damage, something had grown, a community with better oversight, a woman trying to rebuild herself into someone better, an understanding on Jack's part that righteousness could be complicated, that justice wasn't as simple as winning. Carol found him sitting there at sunset. You okay? She asked, as she did so often in those days. Yeah, he said, I'm actually okay. She sat next to him, and they watched the sun set over Clearwater Springs, over the neighborhood that had been the site of their conflict and their strange, unintended redemption. Do you regret it? Carol asked. All of it, the fighting, the legal fees, all the stress. Jack thought about that. No, he said finally. I don't regret standing up for myself. I regret some of the ways I did it, but I don't regret refusing to accept an unjust rule. I don't regret fighting back. Even though it led to all the other stuff. Even though it led to all the other stuff, Jack confirmed. Because the other stuff was already happening, I just made it visible. Carol took his hand. That's a good way to look at it. They sat together in the gathering darkness, watching their neighborhood settle into evening. The truck sat in their driveway, gleaming under the porch light. A simple object that had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up to arbitrary authority, of the complicated nature of victory. Inside the house, their phone rang. It was one of the neighbors, a younger man named David who'd recently moved to Clearwater Springs. He was calling to ask Jack's advice about something the new HOA had asked him to do. Jack talked to him for 20 minutes, offering perspective, offering the wisdom that came from having fought and having won and having learned the cost of victory. When he hung up, he was smiling. What was that about? Carol asked. He wanted advice about dealing with the HOA, Jack said. I told him to stand up for himself, but to stay reasonable, to know when to fight and when to accept reasonable compromise, to understand that every action has consequences. Did he think you were helpful? I think so, Jack said. They went inside for dinner. The house was warm, filled with the smell of Carol's cooking and the quiet contentment of a life well lived. Outside, Clearwater Springs settled into evening, a community that had learned its lessons, that had been tested and had come through stronger. Not perfect, not without scars, but better. And sometimes, Jack thought as he ate dinner with his wife, that was victory enough. Jack received a package in the mail on a Thursday morning. No return address, but the postmark was from Portland. Inside was a book. The author was Margaret Chen. The title was The Power of Stepping Down, How Losing Everything Taught Me to Lead. There was an inscription on the title page in Margaret's handwriting. To Jack, you were right about the truck. You were also right to fight for what was fair. This book is dedicated to people like you who don't accept injustice, and to people like me who had to learn the hard way that power without accountability is just another kind of tyranny. Thank you for pushing back hard enough that I couldn't hide anymore. With genuine respect. Margaret. Jack read the book over the course of a week. It was honest, painful, and thorough in its examination of how Margaret had confused her role in the community with being the community itself. But it was also hopeful. It was about second chances, about rebuilding, about the possibility of being better than you were. He sent Margaret an email thanking her for the book. She replied within hours, and they began a correspondence that would continue for the rest of their lives. Not friendship exactly, but understanding, recognition of each other as complicated people trying to navigate a complicated world. Jack eventually donated his old pickup truck to a local vocational school, where students used it to learn restoration and mechanic work. He bought a new truck, a different model, no less a truck, and never had a single issue with anyone about it. Clearwater Springs went on to become a model HOA community, cited in articles about good governance and accountability. And Jack Morrison, retired contractor, learned to fish, learned to do woodworking, and learned to live with the knowledge that sometimes being right meant accepting complicated feelings about what your rightness had cost. But he also learned that those complicated feelings didn't mean you'd been wrong.